bringing people together to share their ideas and to learn and grow together has a transformational effect. A really excellent dialogue can facilitate understanding, but also can facilitate breakthrough, creativity, and a new idea. And so we try to provide the environment where that can happen.
That's one of the reasons why we have a literary prize, so that we can organize ourselves to hear voices from all perspectives, from all realities, in order to better live our own humanity and build a better society. And that if the ability to imagine someone else's inner life and social world is where compassion begins, then storytelling is the art that kindles that fire. That's why we host a literary prize, to an influential work of literature while surfacing many works that are doing this incredible cultural work of revealing the questions that are hidden beneath our answers.
I come to town the other night. I hear the noise, then saw the sight. The watchmen, they be running round, crying, "Old Dan Tucker come to town. Get out in the way, get out in the way, get out in the way, old Dan Tucker. You's too late to come your supper." Sheep and hog are walking in the pasture. Sheep says, "Hog, can't you go no faster?" "Hush, hush, honey," the wolf growling. "Ah, the Lord, bulldog growling. Get out in the way, get out in the way. Get out in the way, old Dan Tucker. You's too late to come your supper."
Jamil smiled. Zanya had not left her alone, even without her finishing school. She did not like how people thought she was stupid because she had attended only 1 year. "If you want," Nami said, "I will tell Malama Dolores you want to learn. She will give you books. She has many of them." "Me, I'm fine," Jimmy said. "I can help if you do not want Mamala Dolores to teach you. I'm fine, Sha." How many times did she have to be here repeating herself?
There's a Rio Grande in heaven. Oscar and Valeria must cross 1,000,000 times. It is beautiful, much more beautiful than the river on earth. The water is crystal clear. The stones in the riverbed shine like amulets. The cattails dance, bending down to touch the warm water, moving side to side so the dragonflies and bluets can zip through. It is so beautiful, and when migrants arrive at the river's edge, they think to themselves, "Oh, how muddy and cold, how thundering and tempestuous, how ugly and cruel the other river was."
There were children, and then there were the children of Indians, because the merciless, savage inhabitants of these American lands did not make children but nits, and nits make lice, or so it was said by the man who meant to make a massacre feel like killing bugs at Sand Creek, when 700 drunken men came at dawn with cannons, and then again 4 years later, almost to the day, the same way at the Washita River, where afterward 700 Indian horses were rounded up and shot in the head. These kinds of events were called battles, then later, sometimes, massacres, in America's longest war. More years at war with Indians than as a nation, 313.
Eva took up space with a loud restlessness. A bee stuck in a room with all the windows shut. She touched things, talked about the things she touched, asked questions about them. Is this painting supposed to be the Thalawa? Was this your mother's vase? Took to circling the gardens with a cigarette in hand. Put her fingers to the petals of shrubs, the trunks of trees. Isabel avoided her. Isabel watched her from an upstairs window. Isabel dug her nails into her wrists and breathed steadily through her nose.
Good evening, everyone. Hello. It's so good to have you here. I'm Adrienne Brodeur, the Executive Director at Aspen Words. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Institute and at Aspen Words, welcome to the 8th Annual Aspen Literary Prize ceremony. We are thrilled to celebrate these remarkable books and the extraordinary authors behind them. For those of you who are new to us, excuse me, Aspen Words is a literary nonprofit and program of the Aspen Institute dedicated to encouraging writers, inspiring readers, and connecting people through the power of stories. And this prize is essential to that mission. And this year, 2025, is especially meaningful because it's Aspen Words' 50th birthday. Yay! That is a half century of saying books matter, writers matter, and our stories matter. As you know, later tonight, we'll be announcing the winner of this year's prize. But right now, let's celebrate all 5 of these extraordinary works of fiction and the brilliant authors who brought them into the world. The 2025 finalists are James by Percival Everett, published by Doubleday. Before the Mango Ripens by Afabwaje Kurian, published by Zank Books. Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange, published by Knopf. There is a Rio Grande in Heaven by Reuben Reyes Jr., published by Mariner Books. And The Safe Keep by Yael van der Wouden, published by Avid Reader Press. And we are so sorry that neither Tommy nor Yael can be here tonight, but we're lucky to have their representatives in the audience, and we know they're with us in spirit. So most of you know that this prize honors fiction that's not just beautifully written, but deeply relevant. These are stories that illuminate urgent social matters and help us see the world more clearly, because books are one of the most powerful tools we have to connect, to reckon with complexity, and to better understand one another. But before we move on, a few essential thank yous. This prize wouldn't exist without the help of a lot of people. First, our selection committee, Jared P. Woods, Lois Nimkowski, Elizabeth Dowdy. Thank you for your care, discernment, and commitment from the very start. And to our incredible jury, Dr. John Deasy, Louise Erdrich, Ben Fountain, Vanessa Hua, and Tayari Jones. You took on a monumental task. I'm looking at them right down here. And I didn't envy it. And you did it with such thoughtfulness and heart. So a huge thank you. Huge thanks also to all the publishing teams for these books, editors, agents, marketing people, designers. There's so many of you, and we know what it takes to bring a book into this world, and thank you all for what you do. And finally, for everyone else, the rest of you, thank you. Whether you're here in person or online, readers are the absolute heartbeat of this prize. So, big round for all of you. Now it is my honor to introduce our head judge, Ben Fountain. Ben, yeah, more clapping. Ben is the author of Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk, a National Book Award finalist, and most recently, Devil Makes Three, which won the 2024 Joyce Carol Oates Prize. His work has also received the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Penn Hemingway Award, and the Los Angeles Times Book Award for Fiction. Born in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Ben is now back in his home state after many years in Texas. Please join me in welcoming Ben Fountain to the stage.
Thank you, Adrian. There's a bunch of pros here tonight, so I better not blow it. So first of all, I'm supposed to talk about why literature matters, and I do have a few thoughts to offer on that. But first, I want to recognize and thank my very fine fellow judges. First of all, Tayari Jones of Atlanta. Tayari is here. Tayari, would you stand up, please, and take a bow? And our three fellow judges, Dr. John Dacey of Seattle, Louise Erdrich of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Vanessa Hua of Los Angeles. It's been my great pleasure and privilege to work with all of these fine people. So let's start with the proposition: it all depends on language. Society, civilization, democracy, the entire collective project depends on the quality of our thought and expression, our ability to put words to the reality of a thing. Words whose purpose is to portray life as it actually is. That's a rare and even radical act in a time when so much of the language that's thrown at us is trying to sell us something: a product, a lifestyle, a political agenda. Language whose sole purpose is to mislead and distort, to numb us out and dumb us down. In the 1930s, Ezra Pound published an extraordinary little book titled The ABC of Reading, which is still in print, by the way. And in this book, he devotes a good deal of thought to language and its uses. Early on, he makes the basic point that a statement of words is good, that it has meaning to the extent that it corresponds with the facts. And he goes on to say, quote, "Language is the main means of human communication. If an animal's nervous system does not transmit sensations and stimuli, the animal atrophies. If a nation's literature declines, the nation atrophies and decays. Your legislator can't legislate for the public good. Your commander can't command. Your populace, if you be a democracy, can't instruct its representatives save by language." End quote. Notice that he mentions literature. If a nation's literature declines, the nation atrophies and decays. That's a bold statement, the notion that literature might be a national security issue. What could it possibly matter to the survival of a country if the novels and poetry collections that get published every month are any good or not? And if it was ever the case, is it still true today in the age of smart bombs and nuclear weapons and all the occult forms of cyber warfare? But let's go back to Pound and ABC of Reading. There he defines literature as language charged with meaning. And great literature, he says, is language charged with meaning to the utmost degree. I find myself going into a clinch whenever I hear that rarefied word, literature. For me, it conjures up visions of English professors in turtlenecks and ascots, sitting around the faculty lounge saying things like, "Au contraire," and "I beg to differ," indicative of a certain kind of fussiness that seems so far removed from life as it actually is lived. But Pound meant something quite different from that fussy stuff. When he talks about literature, he's talking about writing that gets down into the real stuff of life, all the sweat and worry and guts and sex and pain and politics of it, the down in the trenches human tumble that we're all flailing around in. Writing that corresponds to facts, to lived experience in the fullest sense. Writing that sees things as they are and tells it straight. So when Pound talks about literature or literary qualities, he doesn't mean a bunch of frills and doodads and fancy turns of phrase, but writing that's engaged with all the mess and confusion of life as it's really lived. Now, everyone brace yourselves. I'm going to lay a few lines of poetry on you. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. These lines are from a poem by William Carlos Williams, who, in addition to being one of the finest poets this country has produced, was a family doctor who practiced medicine for more than 40 years. This was a man who had a close working relationship with the most basic realities of human life. He delivered thousands of babies, saw death in 100 forms, and here he is staking a claim to poetry's fundamental usefulness, as in, people literally die because they lack the knowledge that can be found in poems. That's a remarkable proposition to put forward in this day and age, actually an outrageous proposition, that good poems, literary language can actually save lives. But remember what we mean by literary language, not the language of flounces and falderall, but language that digs down into the real stuff of life. Language, as Ezra Pound said, that's charged with meaning by virtue of its insistent fidelity to the facts. So just to come at William Carlos Williams' proposition from a slightly different angle, what do you suppose our individual prospects are for living long and happy lives? In other words, for not dying miserable deaths, if our actions are based not on facts, but on lies, delusions, and fantasies? Or scale it up to the macro level. What do you suppose is the life expectancy of a country that's lost its grip on reality, whose national consciousness is based on lies, delusions, and fantasies, whose dominant mode of expression is the language of advertising, and whose population staggers around in the Walking Dead equivalent of the numbed out and the dumbed down, without the tools for seeing and describing things as they truly are? Maybe that's how we get wars that go on, an economic bamboozlement on a cosmic scale, and a politics that's so dysfunctional it makes a kicked-over anthill seem orderly by comparison. Seeing and describing things as they truly are, that's the proper and essential work of writers. And the writers whose work we're celebrating here tonight, Percival Everett, Afabwajeh Kurian, Tommy Orange, Ruben Reyes Jr., and Yael van der Wouden, they have given us 5 splendid works of fiction that are doing this proper and essential work. Now I want to invite onto the stage, one by one, the 3 fine finalists who are here with us tonight. Percival Everett, would you please come to the stage? Afabwajeh Kurian, would you please come to the stage? Ruben Reyes Jr., would you please come to the stage? So the next order of business, these finalists are going to be led in conversation by Bilal Qureshi. But before he comes to the stage, I want to offer a few words of introduction. And so as I was becoming familiar with Bilal's extraordinary career, the soccer player Roy Kent from Ted Lasso came to mind. And you know what they said about Roy Kent? He's here, he's there, he's every fucking where. So that's Bilal. He is an independent essayist, broadcaster, and critic. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, NPR, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and the Criterion Collection. He wrote the column Elsewhere for the journal Film Quarterly from 2016 to 2023. Bilal's radio reporting has aired across NPR's flagship news magazines and podcasts, and on the BBC Arts Hour. Bilal graduated with high distinction from the University of Virginia and earned an MS in broadcasting from the Columbia School of Journalism. He's a recipient of NPR's Kroc Fellowship, the USC Getty Fellowship for Arts Journalism, and the Robert Bosch Fellowship, and has served as a juror for the Pulitzer Prize in Audio and Criticism. He was born in Kohat, Pakistan, grew up in Richmond, and currently divides his time between Accra and Los Angeles. Please welcome to the stage Bilal Qureshi.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed by taking up more space than I really need to as a moderator, so please excuse me for that. Welcome, and thank you to the Aspen Words Festival, to this incredible opportunity, and it's so nice to be here, and to each of you for these books. I had just the perfect privilege to get a box of these 5 books sent to my house and to get to read them as a family of books. And I would say that, like what Ben was saying in his remarks, I think all of us have our attention sort of splintered and divided and demanded in lots of different reasons, and I felt like each of your books and each of the other 2 nominees that are not here sort of command and demand and reward your attention in a way that I'm really grateful for. So thank you so much. I thought, because I have sort of now do feel like they're a family of books, and so I would like for us to speak about them in sort of thematic ways. But before we do, I wondered if I could ask each of you to talk a little bit about your books individually in your own words. And I thought maybe we could do that with speaking about a character from each, if you could introduce us to a person that we meet in this book so you can have a sense of what is sort of going on. And Reuben, I thought I'd begin with you. It's an incredible short story collection that deals with, we meet a kaleidoscope of characters, but I wondered if you could talk about one particular character that has stayed with me, which is an AI robot who is also a former father. So just tell me a little bit about this story and this character, because this is a futurist book in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, I'm a child of Ray Bradbury and Michael Crichton, so there's a lot of sci-fi in here. That story is about it's not giving too much away, about a son who pays an exorbitant amount of money to bring back his dead father, who he had a complicated relationship with. But he's brought back as this tiny little robot that at first doesn't quite seem to be his father. And you know, it's a story about grief. It's a story about whether or not we can fix the relationships with our loved ones. But I think that's such a good character and story to think about because it captures a lot of the themes in this book, which are really about, you know, how we try building human connections in our splintered world, a world splintered by borders, by capitalism, by, you know, prejudice, a lot of the themes that run through.
And without being too much of a spoiler, the father in question is an immigrant father, and this story is unfolding in contemporary California or future California, where you can have a sort of mail-order dad. And you sort of are also exploring really that division between immigrant children and their parents through this Ray Bradbury-esque kind of, so talk about, you know, the thing is, I mean, in a way you could call your book an immigrant book or immigrant literature, but these are the things that you do that I think are so interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's you know, most of the characters in this book are Salvadoran, but they're all different kinds of Salvadorans, right? There's the children of immigrants. There's Salvadorans who were born in the U.S. and had to come, born in the U.S., so vice versa, people born in El Salvador to come. And I think that's why I love story collections so much. It's like so many entry points for the big questions. And one of the big questions was, how do we make sense of the real life dystopia that immigrants and generations of immigrants are living through? I just had to take a sideways approach because realism was too scary for me.
Yeah, and it's an incredible collection of stories that surprise you at every turn. Afa Bouaji, I'd love to ask you about Before the Mango Ripens, and it opens with a character named Zanya, and if you could introduce us to who he is, when it is, and what you could tell us about him and what's happening with him as he's one of the main characters of the book.
Sure. So Zanya is a laborer. The book takes place in the 1970s in a fictional town called Rabata. And it's a town that's dealing with the presence of white American missionaries. So Zania is one of the 5 main characters that the book follows, and he's a laborer, construction worker working on the church, and he is allegedly survives, this fire that happens in his family's village. So he represents what maybe a lot of young men were going through at that time in Nigeria. It was about 11 years, it was 1971 that the novel takes place. It was 11 years after independence from Britain. And so there were a lot of people who were desiring progress. And Zania represents that ambition. He represents someone who, he's a natural orator, and he knows that he has that gift, but he's also in a place where his gift is being overlooked by Reverend Jim, who is the de facto mission leader, in Rabata.
And he's one of several then characters who are living in this missionary kind of controlled town and trying to find out what their place is within it.
Yeah.
Percival Everett, your book, James, is obviously, most people know it's a response, or I suppose a book in conversation with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but James is not Jim, or is Jim, but can you tell us who is James, and what you can tell us about who he is that we didn't know before?
Had I known there was going to be an exam,
I'm sorry.
I would have studied. I have to apologize a little bit because I suffer from what we in my house call work amnesia, and when I finish a book, I forget the book.
Okay. I mean,
and I know a lot of stuff that happened in there, but I'm constantly surprised when people bring up particular scenes.
You can be as general as you'd like.
Well, James is. This is tough. My answer usually is, if I could say it in a few words, I wouldn't have written a book. But reading Huck Finn and seeing the depiction of Jim that has become the depiction of slaves, the enslaved that we have seen throughout our lifetime, and certainly before that, through the 19th, 20th centuries and into the 21st, the enslaved people are always superstitious, simple-minded, they're capable of eating, drinking, procreating, but certainly not capable of second-order thought and being fascinated with the world in the way that we all understand ourselves to be fascinated with the world. And so James and all the enslaved people in the novel represent that depiction that hasn't been present. And language is at the center of that, as Ben was mentioning, and language is always at the center of everything. But James is when I started the novel, I thought I was going to give Jim agency. And then I realized that, no, Jim already had agency. I was merely giving the character Jim an opportunity to express that agency.
And you've said before in interviews, if you don't mind me, talking about something you said maybe in the past, which is that Mark Twain was not capable of writing Jim, or that this was a limit, that there was a limitation to what he could have done in terms of imagining him. And if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't offer this book up as a corrective to Twain. Twain was writing a novel about a adolescent white boy. He had been an adolescent white boy, so he had a lot of experience with that character. He had not been a black man in this American culture, and his experience with black people had been from the outside, watching the way black people were forced to behave in a culture that was hostile and deadly. What's interesting is in my reading about Twain, Twain wrote this novel without the benefit of another 140 years of so-called human development that goes back and forth throughout time. And as I viewed him, I thought, well, he was a decent person, and I think that's true. But bigotry and prejudice are so complicated that I thought, well, Twain did have fond and truly respectful feelings toward Jim and black people in general. And then I read a book by a woman named Carrie Driscoll about Twain's attitudes toward Native people, which was nothing like my thoughts of his reaction to African Americans. And he fairly hated Native people. So I haven't pulled back on my respect and admiration for Twain as a writer, but it has complicated my understanding of human bigotry and prejudice.
One, I mean, from that, I want to actually come back to each of you to ask about the writing process for these books, because, and I'll sort of stay with you, Percival, for a second, which is that I've read Huck Finn 15 times back to back. Is that right? To start working on James, and the origin of it was as simple as you were playing tennis, and this idea came to you. Is that also correct?
Well, who knows where ideas for books come from? I was playing tennis, and I was probably a self-defense mechanism trying to not think about my last shot, which was horrible. But as I watched the ball sail out of the court, I actually did think, I wonder if anyone has ever told Huck Finn from the point of view of Jim.
As happens during tennis games. Yeah.
It does. My next novel is, wow. Yeah, it's where stories come, and I know that you guys feel the same way. They come from anywhere, and they come suddenly, but they come suddenly after, in my case, 68 years. That's how it works.
And Afabwaji, can you tell us about this novel and how long you worked on this and what the origins of it were, and also going to this time in Nigeria that you haven't necessarily lived in or known personally as intimately as you make it so immersive. So just about that too.
Yeah, thank you. So it actually came from a short story that I was writing called American Wife that took place in the 1990s and took place in the US. So clearly I took a long route to get to before the mango ripens. So it started that way, and I was really interested in the background of Henry, who was the protagonist in American Wife, and so I started kind of digging into his history. I ended up going to Nigeria in 2015, right after I'd started this work, started a short story, and started trying to turn it into a novel. And I interviewed just so many of my relatives about what it was like to just grow up in the 70s, because I was looking for Henry's origin story. And so Zania came to me very strongly. But what also helped was the fact that I was speaking to my uncle, and he was telling me about when missionaries came to our town. And so this is the Baigi people who live in Middle Belt, Nigeria. And he told a story of one of my relatives who would go on excursions with a white American missionary. And whenever the missionary would get tired on these excursions, this relative would carry him on his back. And I was really upset hearing that story. And I think my uncle just kind of looked at me as like a fiery American niece. But, I ended up writing into that image. So it's an image that shows up in the book, except I wanted to turn it on its head. So I had Zania carrying Jim Clemens. And so Jim Clemens comes in and he's like, I want to save the people spiritually. And Zania ends up saving Jim's life. And that was just a twist that I wanted to add to it. And it's something that really upsets Jim, throughout the book, that he was saved by this African man first before he could do the saving, in a way. So I just ended up writing into that idea, and the story kind of, grew legs. And I did have two parallel narratives at one point, one taking place in the 90s and the other taking place in the 70s. But I think the 70s was just more compelling to me. And part of it had to do with the fact that during this time in Nigeria, 11 years after independence, you actually had government takeovers happening where the Nigerian government was taking over, the Western institutions. It was taking over the hospitals. It was taking over the schools, just trying to have Nigerians in leadership in those places. And so it was a very fraught time. And it's also a time when John Gattu, who was he was General Secretary of the Presbyterian Churches of East Africa. He actually called for a moratorium on missions. He wanted missionary activities suspended. So I just thought that was a great time of conflict, spiritually kind of fighting back against the paternalistic attitudes of missionaries and saying that Africans can guard their own spirituality.
And it took you, you were saying 10 years?
10 years, yeah.
And how many trips to Nigeria did you have to take? Or?
Just that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I was born there, that helps, of course, but, I conducted just a lot of interviews and did a lot of research, reading a lot of memoirs as well, and research papers, and doing some archival research also.
Yeah. And Ruben, can you talk about where these, there's so many stories, I suppose, and there's so many characters. We can't trace where all of them came from, but what you could tell us about the origins of this collection and the language you found for them, because I have to say, I'm a big music head, and so there's this sort of playlist quality to them as well, where each one has a completely different vibe and style, and they are really propulsive in a way as well, without reducing their migration poetics. But I'm curious if you could talk about the origins of these stories.
Yeah, thank you. A story, I think this is the beauty of a story collection. It's, you have to write one story, and that's the first step. And then eventually you have some stories and you're like, wait, is this a book perhaps? And that was kind of my journey. I'll say that it really cemented into this, and I'm glad you felt some unity, because it really cemented into a book for me, or a potential book, in 2018. When there was just like a nationwide focus on immigration on the southern border, and the lives and images of a lot of Central Americans in particular, who were being detained and, parents separated from their children, just some really horrific stuff, in a way that had been happening but hadn't been making news in the way it did in 2018. And that's kind of when I came to the central question that kind of guided this collection in the second half, I'd say, of writing it, which was, how do we make sense of that dystopia? Or how can I write dystopia when people are living dystopia? And that informs the kind of genre blend that's in here, and what I think I have to say about migration. I just felt that there was a lot of great writing, in journalism and nonfiction books about the migration, quote unquote, crisis. And so I wanted to approach it at an angle. And that also, I think, informed the approach. All of this, I think, feels like I'm trying to undercut or complicate what people are hearing in the news about the issue of migration.
Before we sort of get into what perhaps some of the questions I had about the books together too, I have to say a humble shout out to the mango, which is getting quite a lot of representation in two of these books. That thing with mangoes, or both of you, would you like to, maybe this is a South Asian bias that I have about the mango, but I enjoyed the kind of fact that your book has a really interesting relationship with the mango at the cover and the first story. If you want to just say something about not making it a easy exotic trope, I suppose, but something that is clearly important to you.
Yeah, I was like basically hearing people talk about like mango poetry, which is like this like impulse to nostalgia, like by children of immigrants to write nostalgically about their parents' home country, which I think is kind of an unfair critique, but also I think I've read that stuff and it does make me cringe.
I went to a South Asian film festival once called Bite the Mango, so
yeah.
the mango has been,
And so, I don't know, the story you mentioned, it really tries to take a kind of satirical look at it. And I think the cover is kind of a little joke too, because it's this beautiful, approachable mango, and then you read the story and you're like, oh, this is kind of horrific.
So I actually based my title on a Baigi proverb, which says, before the ripening of fruit, what were the birds eating? And this is something Kago says to Zanya. Kago's a laborer also, and he's essentially saying, before the missionaries were here, we had our own way of surviving, right? So before the fruit is on the trees, like the birds have their own ways of surviving and foraging for food. So that's where that ended up coming from. And I chose mango because I really did want to have this kind of nod to the global South. And I've had people say, oh, I picked up your book because it had the word mango in it.
It's a really powerful, powerful mechanism. I want to ask about this award and the focus on not only works of enduring literary value, but works that ignite conversations that make us think about things that are happening. Ruben, you referred to kind of what was happening in 2018 and kind of what the book is sort of an angled way of thinking about it. Percival, if I could begin with you about sort of what you make of this idea of, I mean, maybe you would disagree and I'd be happy to hear that too, but about books sort of igniting conversations, inspiring conversations, making us think about issues. How do you feel about that burden on fiction?
Well, first of all, books and art and politics are inextricably bound together. You cannot separate them. They don't exist in space. They exist in a world. Literature, paintings, music. In fact, if the politics is missing, that's the political statement, and you can pretty much turn away from it anyway. Reading is the most subversive thing. I've said this 1,000 times, but now I feel like a broken record. Is the most subversive thing we can do in this culture. This is why people ban and burn books, because they are afraid of you reading. And it's not even second. Writing is not the second most subversive. The second most subversive thing is belonging to a book club. Because it's reading, and because there is then discussion about the work. I don't matter, really. Once the book is made and it's out in space, it's going to mean what it means because of what the reader brings to it. What I meant doesn't matter, even if there was something you could trace to me about meaning, it doesn't matter. Books are scary to fascists because no one can see what's going into you. Even if they're reading over your shoulder, and they are, they don't know what it means to you. You make all the meaning and everything that's important, and you learn to think. When you read and construct, and you are constructing the stories, and you do that, you are creating a world, and you're doing it in a critical way, which means that you can then take that ability to criticize to the rest of your life. That's why art, and because it's attached to language or literature, is so important to us.
And in real time, the spirit has moved the sign there on the podium too. So, yeah, no, it's beautiful. I mean, I'm curious for each of you too, how have you been thinking about the moment in which you're writing and what it means to have your language be read in this way, that what Percival was referring to, and kind of that not only responsibility, but perhaps that flow that you have, that you're in real time with what's happening around us. Ruben, would you like to start?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think a central question when I was writing this book was, how do I write a book that is kind of fearlessly political and captures what I wish we did more of, which is talk about systems? Like, how do you balance that with the fact that one of the big gifts of fiction is access to someone else's brain, someone else's life, the individual experience? And those things felt in many ways at odds with each other when I was writing this book. And so the middle ground I kind of found and kind of strove for was these kind of high concept stories that, either metaphorically or allegorically have something to say, but do contain, if not fully real characters that are pretty close to life, and do the kinds of things that I, loved reading literary fiction for, right? That kind of deep interiority into the lives of others. I don't know. I think about this story all the time. I think about Metamorphosis by Kafka, which is one of my favorite pieces of literature ever. And I love that it's the most bonkers, ridiculous, weird thing, but it's a story about how hard it is to wake up and go to work, right? And I think that's like one of the many people I turn to try figuring out this balance between a really clear, kind of clear-eyed message and the texture that makes fiction so enjoyable and important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I started off, obviously trying to write this political novel, not starting off with American Wife in the 1990s, but when the character of Zanya came to me, and I started to think about the fact that, he was so angry when he came to me, very angry about his body being used for labor and his intelligence being overlooked. And so that's when I started to kind of dig further into just missionary influence and, specifically with the Baigi people. And I started to see just the complexity of what it means to be Black and African and Christian, and I felt like what I'd seen before was, Africans actually either depicted in a way where they have this hostility towards Christianity, or they're incredibly angry about the weaponization of Christianity, rightfully so, or they were obsequious to the European forms or Western forms of Christianity. And so I was actually interested in the complexity of faith and the complexity of having characters who might reject the way that it was brought, but might actually have an authentic experience with Christianity. So that was something that was really interesting to me that I just felt I hadn't necessarily seen before. And so starting with character kind of led me that way.
Well, what I really, I mean, again, it's because of maybe the feeling of reading these books in conversation with each other, and now we're getting to have this extremely privileged conversation, is that it did seem to me that all of your novels have someone having a very powerful awakening of some kind, where there is a kind of, and which I think is in a way my favorite theme to read about, because someone has gone from a kind of status quo, and once they've had this so-called awakening, then there's no going back, because something is going to change, and drama is going to ensue. And I think that in a way, even within all these heavier themes that we've discussed, from migration to colonialism to gender to slavery, there is this kind of power driving through these books of someone who's not going back. And I wondered if you could talk about that, because it's something that each of your books shares, and in a way, I have to say, leaves you as a reader quite heartened and quite, I don't know, like alive in a way, rather than despondent, even if there is the reality that we're all living in. But yeah, if you could talk a bit about that, and if you perhaps are also drawn to that, or were thinking about that. Percival, would you like to begin?
I guess so.
You've been aside, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear that James is experiencing an awakening born out of fear of losing his family, and the extreme circumstances and the moving through this space that is America only solidifies his understanding of that fear and his place in it. And it's not lost on James that his safe passage through this landscape is dependent on this white face, this boy. He cannot move through it alone. It's a reality he has to accept for his survival. And that's what he finally does abandon. The irony, of course, is that the white face isn't the white face that the world is seeing. It just happens to be light skin.
And I mean, in your book, I think, in Before the Mango Ripens, it's also this really incredible moment when people are realizing that they can sort of claim their own, not only cultures, but even take Christianity for themselves and kind of find a new language for it that works for them, which I think is, and yet there is a conflict, but there's also a kind of, an awakening doesn't have to mean a kind of attack, a retaliatory attack.
Yeah, and I think, it takes a long time for Zanya to actually awaken. I think everyone else around him slowly kind of wakes up to what's happening, especially the laborers. They have a sense of how they're being used and, just what's happening with the missionaries. But I think Zanya takes maybe just a longer time because of his family history, because of the things that he suffered at the hands of his family. I think it takes him a while to kind of wake up to what Jim Clemens is doing, because he also wants to have faith in the fact that, I know that Jim is someone who is truly striving to help him, and then you realize, that he's someone that's not. And I think that Jumai also awakens. That's another character. She's a domestic worker for the missionary families, and Tebeya also awakens in a way, and I think it's just indicative of what was happening at that time with the government takeovers. People, I wouldn't say they were awakening to their intelligence. I think, they've always had that, but there was this infantilization that was happening. And so there was a need to reclaim, their spirituality for themselves. And that was something that needed to happen. And when I wrote a draft of the book, I actually didn't have that happening for Zanya initially. And then, it was something that I needed to change just for his character arc.
Well, I mean, we're actually short on time, but I want to ask you a question that actually was inspired by something you said, Percival, in your National Book Award prize ceremony about hope, and the idea that when you looked out at the audience, and we're in the same kind of audience now in the Morgan Library and around books and around incredible books, that there's an immediate sense of community, the subversiveness of a book club writ large, and the hope that one gets from all of these books. But I have to say, we're in a pretty bleak period. And I went to the New York Public Library today as a non-New Yorker, and there were signs everywhere that were protect the freedom to read. They were sort of flashing before you, and there is this looming sense that we're in the middle of a quite acute, I don't know what the anti-spring would be, but the American anti-spring. And I would be curious if you said, I think hope is not a strategy, maybe it was the phrase. But hope is still important. And on that note, we've fully lost the sign. Okay, so I guess the sign isn't giving us hope. But yeah, what maybe we could each of you could say something about maybe what feeling hopeful or feeling the hopeful ability to create, because I feel like creativeness or creativity demands that too, that you can still imagine another reality. So how are you kind of channeling that if you are feeling the weather that I think all of us are? Ruben, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I'll answer with a half-craft answer, which is that when I was writing these stories, right, there's a lot of really heavy topics covered in the stories. But I also wanted them to be playful and a little ridiculous and fun, because that's what life is. It's that balance. And so thinking about the endings, even when we end on a pretty tragic or difficult or harrowing note in some of these stories, I always needed there to be an escape valve for the characters, right? One relationship in the story that could potentially save them down the line, or, one potential, path for them after the end of the story where they do get to live a relatively happy life. And that's kind of how I feel about life in general, right? Because I do think that, there are hard times but there's always that possibility of hope. And so I think that is, it's part of the ethos of the collection, I think. Balancing the light and the dark, because I do really feel that that's how life is.
I think for me, it's just the creative process that brings hope. I know people say, how can you write? People have asked this before, how can you write in times like these, whatever might be happening? But to me, to get to actually, I don't know, create a world of your own is pretty hopeful. To allow whatever you want to happen in this world, you know, is pretty hopeful. So that for me is just what brings me that kind of hope.
We're fucked. You know, we're sitting in this room. It feels good. I see a lot of people who love books and stuff, and it's easy for us to delude ourselves. You know, if my publisher sells 50,000 books, you know, they do a little dance, and it's great. If I sold 50,000 records, I'd never record again. If 50,000 people went to see my film, I'd never make another film. Books, this is not a reading culture. I would love it to be a reading culture. You can help it become a reading culture, but this is an uphill battle for us. And it's not about reading, it's about thinking. The one thing you can be certain of is somebody who wants to ban a book has never read a book. And this American culture right now, I'll just say this current administration has given ignorance its swagger back. I never thought that I would long for those intellectuals of the Bush administration. This is a frightening moment, and so I'll leave it at that. The clowns are running the circus, and we need some strategy.
Well, on that note,
you're welcome.
Yeah.
I was trying to leave it.
There will be a ceremony now, but thank you so much to each of you. It's been a privilege to get to share the stage with you and to read your books, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Bilal Qureshi, and to all of our finalists. Congratulations. I'm Carolyn Torrey, and I'm honored to join Adrian to announce our 2025 prize winner. But first, we have a few very important people to thank for making tonight's event possible. Thank you to the entire Aspen Words team behind the scenes, and yes. And to the Pitkin County Library for hosting a viewing party back in Colorado. Thank you to our Advisory Council, Creative Council, and all the members who support Aspen Words. And thank you to our event sponsors, Brent and Belinda Johnson and Peter Rigby, for making it possible for us to host this event free of charge and be in this beautiful space at the Morgan Library. All right, I'd like to invite our head judge, Ben Fountain, back up to share with us the jury's decision.
Dun, 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 dun. The moment you're all waiting for. And the winner is Tommy Orange for Wandering Stars. And I am so sorry that he is not here with us to celebrate this moment, but we have a video.
Yes, the finalists who couldn't join us tonight did pre-record some remarks just in case, and so we'll hear from Tommy directly now on the screen.
Good evening. My apologies for not being able to join you. At a time like this, it can be hardest to believe in art and how it can impact the world. It also happens to be when we need it to most. Writing itself is an act of faith. You throw your fingers at the keyboard, believing something more will come of it than what you could otherwise record to a voice note and simply transcribe later. Believing there is something bigger than you right behind that same pair of eyes that looks back at you with disgust. It took 6 years to write Wandering Stars. Belief in brief feels sometimes doable, but stretched over time, impossible. I couldn't have written this book without the faith of my wife Kateri and my sons Felix and Solomon, who all saw me through the worst of it in life, and my editor, Jordan Pavlin, who saw me through the worst of it on the page. I'd like to thank the judges and the incredible finalists, all of whom I wish I could have been there to meet and thank tonight. Good night.
Thank you, Tommy, and congratulations. And I'd like to invite someone from the Wandering Stars publishing team up to accept on his behalf.
Thank you so much. I know that Tommy so wishes that he could be here tonight. No matter what I tell him, it's really hard for Tommy to believe that this book, which in so many ways is so internal and personal, resonates with even one reader. And so I know that this award is extra meaningful and reaffirming. Thank you.
All right, everyone, please join us outside in the lobby for some refreshments, and the finalist books are all available for purchase. Thank you for joining us.